You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Welcome to the Fresh Hell podcast. I'm Annie in Boston.
And I'm Johanna in Vienna.
And today we have our very first pre-show ad. So, you know how often in true crime podcasts you end up listening to men selling bras? Well, today's episode is sponsored by Ballsy. It's a company that wants you to pamper your balls or the balls of someone you care about with their high-quality products that are designed to keep the family jewels comfortable and smelling fresh. Just look at all the positive reviews from their 200,000 happy customers. These are definitely high-quality products.
Yes, they sell products like Ball Wash, which is a pH balanced with charcoal wash, suitable for your whole body. Then they have Sex Spray, which deodorizes and helps to alleviate irritation and itching, and Nut Rub, a solid fragrance sure to please anyone intending to spend a little time in close quarters with your balls.
I mean, listen, if someone's willing to spend some time with your bits and pieces, then it's kind of the least you can do, really, isn't it? Just to make sure everything is pleasantly fragrant in that general area. And it makes a fantastic Valentine's Day gift. If the one you love has balls, get them a Ballsy gift set. Maybe the Your Incrediballs Heart Box, which includes 3 Nut Rub solid colognes, including the limited edition Valentine's Day only scent, Drift and Dunes. And then you have the fun of showing them exactly how these products work. Have fun. Listeners of Fresh Hell will get 20% off these wonderful items and more. Use promo code FRESH20 for 20% off. Okay, so one of the episodes that we had a lot of positive feedback on was our Victorian Death Trip episode. So we decided to continue on with that theme. Previously, we told you about some of the just truly unexpected ways that people died during the Victorian era.
And if you haven't already listened to episode 24, we highly recommend you do listen to that first, because that one took us through the Victorian mourning and funeral practices of the time. And we touched lightly on some of today's topics, but now it's time for a deeper dive. Probably the first of many of those deeper dives. We're going to talk about why London was overrun with the dead and what they eventually did to solve the problem.
That's right. And warnings for today, well, it's really just that we're going to talk about a lot of really gross aspects of Victorian life. We're going to talk about some of the bizarre and fascinating history of cholera, overcrowded cemeteries, and we're going to take a ride on the death train. So welcome to part 2 of the Victorian Death Trip. Bring out your dead. All right. First, let's talk a little bit about just why there were so many dead in Victorian London.
Well, one of the biggest problems they had was population growth. The city of London went from approximately 1 million in 1800 to over 6 million by 1900. The city simply could not keep up with the infrastructure and sanitization needs for the city, which meant frequent outbreaks of diseases like cholera. The problem was they didn't yet understand how disease was actually spread or is actually spread. At the time, the belief was that illness spread through miasma or bad smells.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if you could detect germs that way, though, so that you didn't get norovirus and spend your birthday in the hospital because you touched an elevator button and then rubbed your eye because it was allergy season? Just saying.
It would be so useful. To be fair, most foul-smelling things will make you sick, though.
It's so true.
Except for the durian fruit. Did you ever have that?
I have never had it, no. It smells awful, right? But it tastes good?
It smells awful. I had it. Not worth it, in my opinion.
Is it? Does it taste different than it smells? Or does it...
Well, I ate it in Bangkok, and it smells like, if you don't know it, it smells like rotten flesh.
Ugh.
Rotten meat, and the taxi driver kept saying, just keep eating, it tastes like strawberry, so we kept eating it. It never tasted like strawberry, and we ended up gifting it to the taxi driver, and he was super happy because it's a delicacy.
Sure. Oh, yeah. No, I didn't have it before I got sick, and now I can't really eat, like, anything. Like, Doritos and cake are fine, but anything with any kind of nutritional content is bad news.
All right, so back to London. The things smelled bad in Victorian London, like very bad. But the smell wasn't creating the cholera. In fact, probably the other way around. The cholera was making the smell worse. Cholera is of course caused by bacteria, and some bacteria need to have a human host to survive, like herpes for example. That's generally passed through oral or sexual contact when you have a cold sore, you know. But others, like noro and cholera, can stay alive waiting for the next person to infect. Cholera can reproduce and stay alive in its environment, most often being water, because cholera is most often spread through fecal, oral contamination. When drinking water is contaminated, even a little bit, with human waste, this bacteria swims into your small intestine, attaches to your intestinal wall, and produces a toxin. Now remember when we told you to never drink the water if they tell you to not drink the water in episode 45? Yeah, that's one of the reasons why you shouldn't drink the water.
This is exactly one of the reasons why you shouldn't drink the waters. Yeah, there's a ton of information, and it's equal parts disgusting and fascinating on the subject of cholera. You can listen to a bunch of podcasts about it, lots of books. 2 podcasts in particular that I listened to as a refresher for this were Stuff You Missed in History Class and This Podcast Will Kill You. They were both very informative, and we're going to link, of course, to the full episodes in our sources. Also, any information is our mistake, not theirs. But we're not epidemiologists. But basically, this toxin is it's really bad news. So the toxin not only stops you from absorbing water and getting hydrated, but it also causes an inability for your body to rehydrate. It forces all the water out of your body rapidly in the form of violent diarrhea. So, we have about 15 liters of fluid in our bodies, and with a severe cholera infection, you could lose a liter of fluid every hour. You would have absolutely horrifically painful cramping and die of dehydration and shock, sometimes just within hours of the onset of symptoms. And the other kind of, it's gross, but important in terms of how it spreads, is the fact that this diarrhea that you have is pretty much just water full of bacteria, cholera bacteria. So it's just very easy to spread. So cholera is killing people horribly, and these outbreaks were happening around the world, killing hundreds of thousands, probably millions. But what was the cause? They just didn't know. If miasmas or bad smells were to blame, then certainly it would be understandable, because most buildings at that time just had a cesspit in them where waste, which is like a dug well, sort of, where waste would collect. And if they didn't actually remove the waste, or today you would have it pumped, but back then you'd, imagining putting whoever's job it was to lower the bucket into the cesspit to empty it out. But more often than not, that never happened. There was no maintaining of these cesspits. And so they would overflow and leak, and it was just filthy. And then if it wasn't the cesspit under your house that was stinking, then don't worry about it, because there were dung heaps everywhere. And dung heaps are exactly what they sound like, just large piles of human excrement. After midnight, but not before, because it was illegal to do it before midnight, the night men were allowed to come and collect buckets full of literal crap and then resell it to farmers in the suburbs and other rural areas who used it as fertilizer. And it also ran through the streets when it rained. Indeed, it was even just poured into the streets would have these small canals that were meant to handle rainwater, because it rains fairly often in England. That's why they have such good roses. But they'd end up dumping, chamber pots and whatnot into these canals. And so there were lots of ways that excrement ended up flowing or being intentionally dumped into the Thames, which was the main source of drinking water for many at this time.
Yeah, so you can see the problem here. And as we said, people believed illness was either caused by bad smells or poor hygiene. Remember the Victorian belief that cleanliness is next to godliness? But one man, John Snow, was an early believer of germ theory. He was born to a large farming family in York, but was very good at math and went into medicine. In 1849, 5 years before the Broad Street outbreak, he published a paper entitled, quote, "On the Mode of Communication of Cholera," end quote. And in this paper he writes of the germs in water theory. The paper is for the most part totally ignored. And the next outbreak in 1854, Soho finally cemented his theory. Here are some of the reasons Snow was positive it spread through water, not the air. women and children were infected with cholera at a higher rate, and they drink more water than men, who tended to drink more beer and spirits. Can't blame them. Men working in breweries almost never got it. All they drank was beer supplied to them at their work. While many insisted it was poor hygiene and diet that was responsible, Snow made note of a workhouse in the center of an epidemic with some of the worst slum conditions you can imagine. And no one fell ill. And they got their water from a different source than those who got free water at the Broad Street pump. Snow now meticulously tracked all the outbreaks in the Broad Street area and traced them all back to this pump. The authorities were finally convinced to remove the handle from the pump, and the disease stopped. There's now a statue of a pump with no handle honoring his discovery, which saved countless lives. Later on, his theory was given further proof when researchers were able to determine that the public well that serviced the Broad Street pump was only about 3 feet or a little less than a meter from an old cesspit, which was leaking fecal matter. Not good.
No.
So Snow was really quite ahead of his time in regard to germ theory. I think we can safely say that this Jon Snow knew quite a bit, actually.
He really did, yeah. It's funny, when Game of Thrones was big, every time it was the you-know-nothing Jon Snow was popular, and I was always like, but the real Jon Snow knew so much. Oh, yeah. So he was an incredibly talented anesthesiologist. I believe he actually more or less knocked Queen Victoria out for the births of her last 2 of 9 children, using chloroform, which at that time was still a really risky way of using anesthesia, but he really pioneered those methods. Interesting fact about him, he was also apparently a celibate, a teetotaler who never drank alcohol, and he started out as a vegetarian who still had dairy products and eggs, and then transitioned to full vegan diet. And he also regularly swam for exercise. And what did he get in return for his very abstemious, healthy way of life? He was dead by the age of 45 after suffering a stroke that he never recovered from. So the moral of that story is that he gave up cheese for nothing.
It's a sad fate for one of the founding fathers of epidemiology and anesthesiology.
Yeah, it's true. And as you said, even though removing the access to the contaminated water did stop the cholera outbreak, people still weren't convinced. Many still believed that illness was just spread through bad smells and filth was still dumped in the river. And it wasn't until the Great Stink of 1858 when a heat wave that July and August made the smell radiating off the Thames so unbearable that members of Parliament were affected. Apparently, they were seen leaving the building holding handkerchiefs up to their nose and mouths. Finally, as in most things, once it became a real problem for the wealthiest people, they did something about it. And they ended up hiring Joseph Bazalgette to design a new sewer system for the City of London, one which would no longer dump sewage into the Thames. I'm not going to tell you a lot about this London sewers because you don't need to know it, but I do want to say that there were pump houses that were built for moving the wastewater, and I'm going to post a photo of one of the surviving pump houses because it's Victorian, so it's like gorgeous. Like even the inside of this like sewer pumping station.
So it's pump house porn.
Yeah, it's pump house porn, y'all. We are going to share it. And also, I just want to point out, cheers to Joseph Bazalgette, because he was a visionary. When he was figuring out the size that he needed to make the sewer pipes be in order for them to work for a long time, he apparently calculated the absolute maximum sort of number of people that could be in a dwelling. He always rounded up, and so once he looked at the maximum number of people in a space and even provided for that space getting, going up, getting larger, he had the correct diameter of the pipe and then he doubled it. He said something along the lines of, well, we're only going to do this once. And so he just doubled it. And he was absolutely right to have done so. Those same sewers are still working today. And so I thought that was, well done, sir. But there was still an issue of rather terrible smells in London, and while the cholera outbreaks didn't help, they weren't the cause. This smell was the smell of decaying human flesh. The graveyards were just completely overrun. There was no place left to put the remains of all these people who were dying. Many of the graveyards were well above street level because they just kept adding more bodies to the pile, basically. So caskets would be taken and used as firewoods, and then the bodies would get broken up in order to fit better into small spaces available. It was very disrespectful, but also just disgusting and indeed very, very unsanitary. One of the most notorious of these overrun burial grounds is the horrific tale of what allegedly happened at Enon Chapel. Now, this story goes something like this. Near the Strand on Clements Lane, which I think is now St. Clement's Lane, there was a small church known as Enon Chapel, which opened its doors in 1822. The Baptist minister who ran the church, a man by the name of W. Howes, he used the basement as a cheap option for his poor parishioners when it came to interring their deceased loved ones. In this case, we're talking about like underbuilding interment. It's not uncommon at all in the UK to have, the dead interred underneath the church itself. Is that something that you do in Austria?
The only place I can think of would be the St. Stephen's Cathedral, so the Stephansdom in the inner city. When you take the underground tour, you can see heaps of bones, which are supposedly people who died from the plague, if I remember correctly.
We'll have to do the tour when I visit.
Yeah, definitely. You're gonna love it. Other than that, I don't think I ever heard of this practice.
So in England's churches and cathedrals, you can look down at the floor and you'll see who's buried under the floor. Like every floor tile in some of the cathedrals over there will have a different name and dates on it. And then I've been to ossuaries, which sounds like what you're talking about with the one in the Czech Republic. I think it's the Sedlec ossuary. I might be mispronouncing that. And that was amazing. It's all plague victims' bones, bone chandeliers and bone. It's amazing. But in any case, it was done in England at the time. And the really appealing aspect of Enon was that Reverend Howe was offering burial for the price of about 15 shillings, which was, at the time, over 100 shillings less than the usual going rate. So, especially during this time, if you were poor, every family member, even children under the age of 5, would have been working. So if you lost a family member during this time, it also meant that you were losing income. But you might also remember from our previous discussion on Victorian burials that they were really important to people, and avoiding a pauper's grave at all costs was just so important. And you also had to avoid the possibility of your loved one being dug up and robbed, or the body being taken from medical schools. So at this time, it wasn't even unheard of that I read a few accounts where creditors would get a hold of the body of a loved one and hold it hostage until their debts got paid. These were wild times. It was very important to the Victorians that their loved ones rested in peace. So Mr. Howes would take advantage of these concerns in the worst possible way, allegedly. All right, so the scandal around Enon Chapel lies in just how many bodies went under the church, which were apparently far too many to fit. It's said that when space ran out, Mr. Howes chopped up the coffins for firewood, and then he chopped up the bodies as well. He stuffed them into small spaces to make room below. Sometimes he'd drop them into the open sewer that ran beneath the chapel, where they'd be carried away to the Thames after rotting in stagnant water for a little while. The smell was said to have made people worshipping above very sick, and most of the reports also say that grave bugs were found in the hair and clothing of the worshippers who had left the chapel. The children called them body bugs. Isn't that charming? So it was said that Howes would fill up carts full of bodies and then drive them over by Waterloo Bridge and toss them into the Thames, and that it wasn't uncommon for him to just drop body parts out of the cart on his way, right? They said he would grind up bones and sell them to market gardens as bone meal. They said that quicklime was brought in and dumped in the basement to help speed up decay. There's all these different accounts of Enon Chapel, and if you search, you're going to find all these different horror stories. And all the different accounts have different numbers for the total number of bodies that were disposed of here, but they're all in the thousands. Here's where it gets weirder. So when the pastor died, the space ended up getting turned into a dance hall. So apparently they put down another floor, and then you were able to dance with the dead, so to speak, as long as you were wearing shoes and stockings, which I think was the Victorian equivalent of like no shoes, no shirt, no service. Do they have that in the bars that you've worked in?
No, we always wear shoes. We don't need that. Which is not true. I used to have a regular customer who never wore shoes. Never. Not in summer, not in winter. He was a very nice customer, but very interesting talks with him. But yeah, he never wore shoes.
Never wore shoes. Yeah, no shoes, no shirt, no service. Sometimes there's variations on that. I think it's really common because I grew up in an area that's got so many beaches, like it's such a beach town, that it's like if you don't say that you need to be wearing these things, then people will come in, like men especially, will come in just wearing bathing suit shorts, swim trunks. Yeah. And it's like, there are places where that's fine, but mostly not. All right, so these dances continued until around 1848 when Mr. George Alfred Walker, he was a surgeon on Drury Lane and a passionate sanitation reformer. He bought the chapel, which was in the same neighborhood where his practice was. He also believed in the miasma theory of illness, and he was a very, very vocal activist on the issue of overcrowded cemeteries and the need for sanitation reform. So in 1839, Walker had begun a long campaign to try to stop more burials in the already desperately overcrowded churchyards, and he wrote a pamphlet. It's like a little book entitled Gatherings from Graveyards, and he was also known to be very kind to the poor. I saw that mentioned in a few places, so that's worth mentioning. So when he bought the place, he became known as a philanthropist who spent around £100 of his own money to remove the bodies from underneath Enon Chapel, and according to reports, there was just this huge pyramid of thousands of bones, and it was a spectacle that thousands of people came to see. I think one thing I read said 6,000 people came to see these piles of bones coming out from underneath Enon Chapel, and this was in no small part because Walker made it such a spectacle. Of course, this furthered his cause, right? The more people he could sway to this sort of horrific stuff, the better his chances of getting what he wanted done were. But yeah, all these bones were finally moved and buried into a mass grave at Norwood, which was one of the new cemeteries that had just opened as a result of the Burial Act. But how many burials were there really underneath this chapel? I was a little sad because I found some writings by Dr. John Snow himself, and he really disputes the high number in his 1843 writings. So he published a paper, I think, called Health in Towns, an examination of the report and evidence of the Select Committee of Mr. Mackinnon's bill presented to the House of Commons June 14th, 1843, and of the Act of establishing cemeteries around the metropolis. Letters to W.A. Mackinnon. So in this paper, Snow essentially concludes that, he looks underneath Enon, and he basically says, there's no way that any of these stories are true. There just wasn't enough space. It was too small a space, and there was no open sewer washing bloated bodies down into the Thames. And even if there had been an open sewer, which there wasn't, it wouldn't have been big enough for a body to go through without blocking it and causing serious issues. So in the end, he described all of the terrible things that had been reported as, quote, a mass of fictitious horrors, end quote. So yeah, I was a little bit sad, I admit, when I read Snow's account of it because I'd heard about it and it was like the main thing, and I was like, oh, I'm going to tell them all these stories about Enon, and then I got to John Snow's report on it and I was like, well, hang on a minute, this looks like none of it's true. So yeah, I don't know. It seems like everything about it was really literally grossly exaggerated. So I don't know, because I think John Snow was the sort of person who was very much ruled by science and truth. I tend to believe his account. I don't know. What do you think?
I know you were sad. It's the kind of stories you like. You wish to be true. I guess he has a point there. I guess he's right.
It seems, I think it was bad. There's no question. It was bad everywhere, but it wasn't like thousands of bodies. It was still plenty of a horror show, but just exaggerated.
That one instance of Enon might have been embellished to make a point, but it was a fact that overcrowding was an understatement as far as cemeteries were concerned. It really was awful. There just wasn't any space, and graves were piled high until there was sometimes only inches of space between the topmost rotting corpse and the ground. It was absolutely foul, but payment for burial was an income source clergymen relied on, and so people weren't getting turned away. Once the Burial Act of 1852 went through, it meant that there wouldn't be any new burials within the London city limits, except for royalty, of course.
Of course.
There had, of course, been some park-like cemeteries outside the city limits, spacious parks built in the semi-rural suburbs, such as Kensal Green, which fans of the show Fleabag might recognize.
Yeah, it's where she goes running. I love that show.
That cemetery had opened in 1832, and of course there was Highgate, which opened in 1839, but these options were much too expensive for the vast majority of London's working poor, who couldn't afford to get there, much less pay for a funeral there. But still, reformers like Sir Edwin Chadwick, English social reformer who is noted for his leadership in reforming poor laws, and institution major reforms in both sanitation and public health in the cities. And this was something he had been trying to pass for years. And in his book, Dirty Old London, The Victorian Fight Against Filth, Lee Jackson writes, quote, "It was the resurgence of cholera in the capital that finally persuaded ministers that action was needed. The interment question passed into the hands of another long-time public health campaigner, Edwin Chadwick. Parochial authorities in Lambeth, fearing imminent government intervention, slashed their burial fees, a rather grim clearance sale. The resultant 1850 Metropolitan Interment Act was Chadwick's attempt to bring in his earlier plan for, quote, national cemeteries, end quote. It remained a remarkably radical scheme, but the public's enthusiasm for the sanitary cause and the threat of cholera persuaded the Whig government of the day to hastily accept what the previous administration had so empathetically rejected. The stated intent of the legislation was to close church walls, churchyards, and burial grounds within the metropolis. One or more large public cemeteries would be established in their place, situated beyond the built-up city and managed by a central commission. The ground would be divided into consecrated and non-consecrated, with one chapel for the established church, another for dissenters, just like at Kensal Green. The price of funerals would be regulated on a sliding scale suitable for the different social classes, and the clergy compensated for the loss of burial fees based on their income over the previous 3 years. Likewise, owners of closed burial grounds and cemeteries would be awarded appropriate compensation." End quote.
Yeah, so when Chadwick proposed this, he was also talking about, Kensal Green and other garden-like cemeteries, and they weren't overcrowded at all, but instead of proposing to nationalize them, he just wanted everything closed and to start from scratch. Again, still quoting Jackson here, quote, "Chadwick's most novel proposal attempting to address the complaint that the poor would struggle to afford travel to distant cemeteries was to suggest that the, quote, chief metropolitan cemetery should be in some eligible situation accessible by water carriage," end quote. The suggestion that new cemeteries might be located alongside railway lines conveying coffins and mourners by rail had long been mooted as a solution to the expense of travel, although some considered the idea lacked dignity. Chadwick, whilst not ruling out contracting with railway companies, believed that steamboat funeral barges would resolve the issue in a stately fashion, but it would prove completely unworkable, end quote. Ultimately, it just came down to money. It would be too expensive to do things that way. And we're still quoting Jackson here because ultimately he really summed this bit up so much better than we could. So, quote, "The great problem with Chadwick's plan for nationalization was the level of compensation that would have been required to buy out existing commercial interests. Ultimately, the Treasury refused to back the scheme, and new, simpler legislation was drafted in 1852. Parishes were empowered to take out 20-year government loans to build garden cemeteries around the outskirts of London, or rent space in existing suburban grounds. Meanwhile, foul burial places in the center of the metropolis, whether parish or private, could be closed by order of the Secretary of State. The government was keen to show that the new legislation was practical and effective. Within the first year of the Metropolitan Internment Act's operation, the Home Secretary, Lord Palmerston, had issued closure notices to nearly 200 sites. This produced harsh words from the Bishop of London, who noted that 36 of 43 available grounds had been closed in the East End, creating intense pressure on the remaining sites, while parochial cemeteries were still under construction. Quote, "The corpses of children were frequently carried to the places of sepulture in cabs, and that it was no uncommon sight to see a string of such vehicles filled with dead bodies waiting at the gate of an unconsecrated burial ground until they could be admitted. He need not say that on such occasions the solemn services of the church were performed in a slovenly, irregular, and indecent manner." End quote. I mean, really, they're using the most horrific examples, but these things did happen. So, according to the UK National Archives, quote, Chadwick's report led to setting up a royal commission and then to the Public Health Act of 1848. He became one of the commissioners. Unfortunately, many people found Chadwick rather rude, and he often provoked opposition. In 1854, he was forced to retire. This letter was sent to the Times to explain why he was unpopular. Quote, we prefer to take our chance with the cholera than be bullied into health. There is nothing a man hates so much as being cleansed against his will, or having his floor swept, his hall whitewashed, his dung heaps cleared away, and his thatch forced to give way to slate. It is a fact that many people have died from a good washing. End quote.
Speaking of a good washing, our sponsor for the episode is Ballsy, the grooming products for male parts. And especially for upcoming Valentine's Day, Ballsy offers the limited edition Nuts About You gift set.
It comes with ball wash, which is an activated charcoal wash packed with essential oils and plant extracts that are sure to please your nether regions. It comes with nut rub, which is a solid cologne for keeping your boys below and any other parts of your body smelling nice and fresh. That comes in 6 fragrances. And of course, the indispensable sack spray. It's a portable deodorizing spray, which is great for freshening up on the go, perfect for gym bags or just really gross hot days when you know that you're not going to have time to take another shower.
The Nuts About You set retails for $45, but Ballsy was so generous to give us a coupon code. When ordering, use FRESH20 to get a 20% discount.
Yeah, this is not an affiliate link. We're not making any money off of this, but I think everybody could appreciate a little bit of a discount.
Yes, I certainly can. And you can order all Ballsy products on their webpage, www.ballwash.com.
All right, so we had putrefied bodies just all over the place. They had to move cemeteries out of the city limits. And the solution to this problem is honestly something I cannot believe I didn't know about until we researched this episode. So this is the most exciting part for me. I bet it will be for a lot of you too. It's the first time I'm excited about trains. All right, so one of the solutions was the London Necropolis Company. It was founded by Sir Richard Brown, B-R-O-U-N. Brown?
Brown?
Could be. That's a possibility. Also, Richard Spire, who was not a sir, but we know his name. All right, now, the vast majority of the information on the London Necropolis comes from one source. Like, everything that you look at, it always links back to this one source, and that is historian John M. Clark, who is without a doubt the expert on the topic of the London Necropolis. And so we're going to link to his website, which is john-clark.co.uk, which also has information on his upcoming lectures. I'd actually love to hear him speak the next time I'm in the UK because, his specialty is right up my alley, isn't it? All right, so London Necropolis. Their logo featured plenty of clues to their business, so if you couldn't read, their logo was a skull and crossbones with an emptied hourglass surrounded by an Ouroboros, which is a snake eating its own tail. It's that ancient symbol of life and death. So lots of death imagery. Love it. Their formal name was the London Necropolis and National Mausoleum Company, and they were a cemetery operator. They were established in 1852 by the Act of Parliament in reaction to all the problems that erupted when they closed London's graveyards, 1851. So the company bought a huge parcel of land in Brookwood, Surrey, about 25 miles or 40 kilometers outside of London, and they used this land to create, at the time, what was one of the largest cemeteries in the world, Brookwood. Today it is still the largest cemetery in the United Kingdom and one of the largest in Europe. The cemetery is listed as a Grade 1 site in the Register of Historic Parks and Gardens, and to get there, you and the body of your loved one would travel by train, a special train, the London Necropolis Railway. Although the Brookwood site was a long distance from London, the speed of the railway made it both quicker and cheaper to get to than the 7 existing garden cemeteries which sort of ring around London. All of those required a slow and expensive horse-drawn hearse to carry the body and mourners from London to the burial site.
Okay, so here's how it worked. The first thing you have to be aware of, because this was Victorian England, was that there were 3 classes of funerals offered. So that the well-to-do in polite society wouldn't have to share space with the unwashed masses. There were also separate cars to keep those of the faith, the Church of England, safely away from Papist Catholics, Jews, and any other sort of heathen not affiliated with the Church of England. So we'd both be in the nonconformist carriage.
Oh yeah, the fun carriage.
It's the best one. Hey, at least we're all together.
Exactly.
So the caskets in the special carriages for caskets also were separated by class and religion.
That's so funny to me, isn't it?
You shouldn't mix. No mixing and mingling.
Even when you're dead, it's like, well, I want to make sure that my loved one's casket isn't with the poor people's loved ones. Like, what on earth? Priorities, man.
So the cars were actually all pretty much the same, but with nicer ornamentation that could be switched around in case you needed a lot of first-class passenger seats or a lot of third-class passenger seats. You know, that sort of thing.
Smart way to do it.
Now let's look at the different funeral packages. The London Necropolis Company offered 3 classes of funerals, as we said, and this is from John Clarke's book on the subject, and we'll link to it in our sources as always.
So, a first-class funeral meant that you could choose where in the cemetery you wanted your loved one to be buried. Of course, there were some more desirable, prettier areas, and that would cost a little bit extra. Like, oh, sorry, you want to be within view of a tree? That's another 50 pence. I don't know how money works.
Yeah, sure. It's prime real estate.
Exactly. When the cemetery opened, the cost for a first-class burial was £2, 10 shillings, and it was a basic 9 by 4 foot or 2.7 meter by 1.2 meter, so sort of what you imagine is the grave, with your basic coffin. It was expected that most who opted for the first-class package would also opt for more lavish caskets, and that they would also install a permanent marker, statue, something of that nature on the grave. And that grave was then yours in perpetuity. Second-class funerals cost £1. Now, the literature I've read says this would be about £92 in 2020 terms, but I don't think that's accurate because I honestly don't think you can bury someone for less than £100 in the UK, because it's certainly not possible to do that here. So I'm not really sure about that. I mean, I trust all the information. I'm just not sure about that inflation number. Seems suspect to me. But yeah, so the other thing with the second class is that they were allowed some control over the burial locations. So if you wanted a permanent marker, then you could do that, but the right to erect one would cost you an additional 10 shillings. And you really wanted to make sure that you could afford that marker, that gravestone, that statue, whatever it was you wanted to put in, because if a permanent memorial was not erected, then the LNC reserved the right to reuse that grave in the future. And finally, third-class funerals. Now, these were, of course, reserved for the poorest of the poor. These were pauper funerals. These people were generally buried at the expense of the church in the section of the cemetery that was designated for that parish. So, as the parishes in the city were no longer able to have on-site burials, different parts of the cemetery were set aside. So, like miniature churchyards for each of the parishes within the cemetery. Hopefully that makes sense. Third-class burials, you could not erect a memorial marker. Although apparently you could save up your money and upgrade your loved one to a grave with a marker, but this seems to have been very, very rare. The good thing about Brookwood was that unlike even the other nice garden cemeteries, like Kensal Green, they did not allow mass graves. The only exception to this was if you buried family members together, which that makes perfect sense. So if you had, say, a family that all died of cholera, they might all be put together into the same grave, but you would never have a bunch of strangers, as was happening in all the other cemeteries at that time. They were still using mass graves, which would just be all the paupers of that week would go into one.
Yeah.
It was still considered a lot more dignified. Brookwood Cemetery had a lot of practical aspects working for it. It was one of the only cemeteries that allowed burials on Sunday. For the working poor, this was very appealing because it meant that you could attend a funeral without losing wages. Also during this time period, theatrical performances were banned on Sundays, making it very popular with actors and others involved in the theater that there was actually a dedicated area right near the cemetery station for people who worked in the theater.
As for the station in London, well, I think Annie would have loved to have seen that
in
the original.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so sad I didn't have, well, no one will ever see it.
Yeah. There were 2 locations for the station. The first was in operation from 1854 to 1902, and the second one was in operation from 1902 to 1941. The first was designed by architect William Tite and engineer William Cuppet, and it ran on the existing London and South Western Railway tracks. So the building site was selected in Waterloo near the London South Western Railway's recently opened London terminus at Waterloo Bridge Station, which is now London Waterloo, of course. And the building was beautiful and specifically designed for grieving mourners. The Westminster Bridge Road entrance to the first London terminus featured beautiful ornate gates that had been originally designed for the Great Exhibition. And as you entered the first and second class entry, because obviously they were separated, there was a grand entrance hall and then a grand staircase. It was furnished with plenty of private waiting rooms, which could double as spaces to hold a funeral. And the third class poor would enter from another area with a way smaller staircase.
There were also 2 mortuaries on the premises and a large stockroom with several hundred coffins on hand. Now, we've said before, most people would have purchased their own decorative coffin before their death, or their families would have provided one for them, but the Necropolis Company kept these on hand just in case, say somebody staying in a local hotel were to die, or there was a sudden unexpected accidental death, then the London Necropolis Company could be depended on to come in and remove the deceased in one of their own crafted, quote, wooden overcoats. I've never heard that expression have you, a wooden overcoat?
Yeah.
You knew that? I've never heard that.
In Austria, we have a way better word. You're gonna love that.
Oh, good. What is it?
We say Holzpyjama.
Holzpyjama?
Holzpyjama, which is a wooden pyjama.
Wooden pajamas.
Yeah, it's the word for coffin.
Oh, no. That sounds so splintery and uncomfortable, though, doesn't it? Wooden pajamas. No, thank you. All right. So upstairs on what people in the UK would call the first floor, but Americans would call the second floor. Do you have this same thing in Austria? Do you say like ground floor, first floor, second floor?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but in England, they don't say ground floor. They say first floor. No, they say ground floor.
No, they say ground floor. It's just like everybody else on this planet except for the Americans.
Is it just us that don't do it?
Yeah.
Oh, I hate it when that happens. It makes me feel like an idiot. All right, everyone. So listen, fellow Americans. What we call the first floor, everyone else calls the ground floor. And then what we call the second floor, everyone else calls the first floor. And therefore, and then on and so forth. And that's as mathy as I get. So upstairs on the first level, what the UK would call the first floor and what we would call the second, there was a large boardroom, workshops for making those caskets, and then waiting rooms for some of the second and third class funerals. There were also the main toilets for the building. And the second or third floor, depending on where you're from, aka the top floor in this case, was level with the railway line, and the platform where the train stopped was on this top floor. So there were 8 or 9 waiting rooms for first-class mourners and further toilets for just their use. In keeping with the superstition of the time, I thought this part was actually really cool. There was a glass roof positioned so that no shadow would ever be cast on the carriage, the hearse carriage that contained all the caskets, because that would have been considered very, very bad luck. You remember we talked a little bit in the Victorian death trip about, turning pictures over and just trying to make sure. So yeah, shadows would have been very upsetting to have seen. From a practical standpoint, a steam-powered hydraulic lift was installed to raise coffins from street level to platform level, and there were niches carved into the existing railway arches that were used for the storage of bodies when they had a lot of business. Coffins would be unloaded at street level from the horse-drawn hearse and put on the hydraulic lift. First and second class funeral goers were allowed to watch the process if they were inclined to do so.
Of course, everyone on board the train needed a ticket, including those traveling in the wooden pajamas, in their caskets, and their tickets were obviously one way. So, at 11:35 a.m. or 11:20 a.m. on Sundays, the train would leave London for Brookwood, arriving at Necropolis Junction, where the branch line into the cemetery left the main London South West Railway line at 12:25 p.m. or 12:20 p.m. on Sundays. That's the timetable from Wikipedia, in case you're wondering.
Yeah.
So on November 13th, 1854, the first train left London for the new London Necropolis. The first burial was that of stillborn twins of Mr. and Mrs. Hoare of Southwark.
Southwark, yeah.
Southwark?
Southwark. It's probably like, no, I think it's Southwark, but it's probably like Sowark or something completely different.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it.
That's okay. I think it's more important to let people know that the Hoare twins were H-O-R-E.
Would you pronounce it differently?
No, it's the correct pronunciation. That's Hoare, but it sounds wrong. You say like...
Okay, so those twins of this family were, along with the other burials on the first day, they were all pauper funerals and they were buried in unmarked graves. And in 1899, the location of the necropolis station was blocking the desperately needed expansion of Waterloo Station. And, after a lot of negotiation, the London South West Railway reached agreement with London Necropolis Company. And in return for giving up their existing site, the LSWR would pay the Necropolis Railway for a new station on Westminster Bridge Road. And part of that building is still there today and was designed to be beautiful in a time when other funeral homes were pretty much not beautiful. So, Annie, have you seen it?
There's a picture that I will post. That part of it is still there and it's beautiful.
So the company moved into this new building in 1902 and business carried on until 16th of April 1941 when the trains, tracks and terminal were heavily damaged by one of the many bombs dropped on London during, of course, the Blitz. It wasn't financially sound to continue and the death train ceased to be. You can still see the offices of the London Necropolis Company at 121 Westminster Bridge Road, including the first-class entrance to the 1902 terminus. And of course, as Annie said before, we'll post photos.
Yeah, that's right. So the cemetery itself, it's still the largest in England and features the Brookwood Military Cemetery, which takes up about 37 acres and is the largest Commonwealth War cemetery in the United Kingdom. There are sections as well dedicated, like there's an American military cemetery. There are lots of reburial areas. At least 21 burial grounds were relocated to Brookwood on the railway in order to make room for the London Underground and sewer projects. But ultimately, it was never really quite as successful as they hoped it would be. But the Brookwood station is still there. It's spread over 500 acres, and there are more than 225,000 people buried at Brookwood Cemetery. And I believe they're still being buried there. And that is the story of the London Necropolis Railway, which I don't know why I was like, there was a railway with caskets? What? Like, it's just, like, my mind was like...
It's amazing.
It makes so much sense, too, doesn't it? Like, it really does seem like a reasonable solution, the way they did it.
It has something of a very dark, very, very morbid Harry Potter.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't like the class thing. And the area where the train passed, I think they said it was like... It was really pretty. Like, I think it went through Richmond Park and Windsor Park. And so they thought, this beautiful scenery would help console the mourners on the train. And yeah, I don't know. The whole thing is just, it's really interesting. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, before doing this, I never heard of that before.
I didn't either. I'd never heard of it. It's the part of this I was, most excited about for sure. I was like, what? The death train? I'm here for it. All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed this little tidbit of history. We still have lots more to cover in the Victorian era, and we'll be doing more of this down the road. All right. So something good.
Yeah, I have a recommendation because yesterday my neighbor was over. We ordered some Vietnamese food and we watched the first 3 episodes of The Outsider, which is the new show based on the Stephen King novel The Outsider, and it stars Jason Bateman, which I love so much, but he's always going to be Michael Bluth for me.
I know.
And Ben Mendelsohn, who is so good. He's good in everything. I don't know if you watch Bloodline, the Netflix show.
No.
He was in that too.
Oh, nice.
You should watch it. The Bloodline, it's set in the Keys, Florida Keys.
Oh, I love the Florida Keys. Yeah. Nice.
So yeah, The Outsider. It's dark, it's morbid, it's very mysterious, and I think... There are only 3 episodes out now, or maybe it's 4 already.
Okay.
I highly recommend it. This far, I like it a lot. I hope it stays that good.
Nice. I know somebody in the Facebook group was recommending that as well, saying that they really were enjoying it. Nice. My something good this week is it looks like we're going to be able to start planning a trip with some friends of ours to Ireland later on this spring. So both my husband and I, our mother's health is, up and down. And so we were a little bit hesitant to book anything. But yeah, I think it'll be my second time going to Ireland and Paul's first. And my first big trip for a long time. So I'm looking forward to that very much. Yeah. So
I'm very jealous. I've never been.
Have you not? You want to come meet us?
I can't.
I know.
I have to buy tiles and carpets and...
It's exciting. It's fun stuff. So thanks so much for listening. Please rate, review, subscribe, tell a friend.
Join our absolutely fabulous Facebook group.
It's such a nice group of people. They're going to give us a lot of grief about our ads this week.
They're gonna love it. That's why I was laughing so much. Somebody posted a photo of a baby bird. What was it? A pelican?
What was it? Oh,
the baby bird. You remember the photo? Yeah. And it looked like a pair of testicles. And I commented, this is gonna be so much more fun once you hear this week's episode.
It's so true.
No, but we're very thankful for our sponsor.
Oh, always. Very. Yeah. Oh, you have to be able to laugh about this kind of thing. It's going to be fun. So, yeah, check out Instagram. Johanna's really good at the Instagram.
We have Twitter. We have a merch store. You can find it on our webpage, www.freshhellpodcast.com. Yeah.
That's right.
Say hi to your dogs.
Say hi to your cats and your guinea pigs.
Wallabies, bunnies, guinea pigs, yes.
Yep.
Laura has guinea pigs.
Yep. Everybody, snuggle your fluffy and scaly friends. And until next week, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Best on train, I guess. Tschüss.
Bye.